Welcome classic rock fans to another episode of Classic Album Review, where classic albums are excavated and explored. And today I want to talk about Richard Thompson's Mock Tudor. Franklin D. Roosevelt famously said that if civilization is to survive, we must cultivate a science of human relationships. And this album, essentially a collection of metrocentric vignettes, explores these relationships, critiquing the disappointment and despair in our failure to connect, or that love torn off unused, to borrow a phrase from Philip Larkin. This simmers beneath the surface of life in the suburbs, London's suburbs to be specific. And this album is very much about peeking beneath the surface, the facade, on an album ironically titled Mock Tudor. This record is dynamic musically and is infused with dry observational wit, which often belies the pathos associated with the commerce of everyday life. It's an assured strut of an album with some great guitar work from Richard Thompson, lending this whole thing a muscular quality as these songs are thrashed out, in making the whole thing feel more like a band effort, perhaps more so than is the previous releases that came just before this one. This is a kind of concept album, or loose concept album you might say, more a collection of songs based around a particular setting, which look thematically at the thrust and parry of everyday life. There is a nostalgic air to this one, with allusions to fairy tales and children's stories, as well as the anointed like Shakespeare. One can almost hear the grim proclamation of last orders from the wasteland if we listen really carefully. These narratives of dysfunction and despair are tarred with Thompson's specific brand of perceptive cynicism, a subject matter that rattles its chains from the margins of much of his writing, I have to say. One is often reminded of the refrains in those early Richard and Linda Thompson numbers, as one critic pointed out, as they were singing songs about their curdled love at one another across the blasted North American stages. In a world where things are not as they should be, or not as they appear to be, again the clue is in the title, honesty and connection is yearned for. And there's this conflict in these songs that help them resonate with us. Music critic Neil McCormick described Thompson as a sharp, observational singer-songwriter whose work burns with intelligence and dark emotion. And it's this dark emotion and psychological intrigue that makes these songs a compelling listen, focusing on the dread of what is, tempered only by the pain of what might have been. In the words of that old Hoagie Carmichael song, "Love is but the stardust of yesterday." The melodies on this album are well constructed and get right under your skin with every subsequent listen, reminiscent of those timeless ballads with Fairport and post-Fairport, of course. I mean, there's no doubt he's an exquisite guitar player, and he explores some interesting tonalities and time signatures. A lot of the songs have some of certain jazz intonations, whilst still occupying those specific folk resonances, of course, we'd expect from him. I mean, he's a wonderful guitar player, much overlooked, I have to say. I also enjoy a lot of the session work he's done over the years, particularly with Jerry Rafferty. Thompson's style is defined as a combination of hybrid picking and some rather strange tunings. He often explores those interesting harmonic qualities and nuances, described by the music critic Kitty Empire as possessing an unfussy beauty. A shout out has to go to the production work on this album. The producers, of course, were Tim Rothrock and Rob Schnaff. I hope I said his name right. Of course, these producers were famed for working with bands such as the Foo Fighters and Beck. Of course, those production values does give this album a bit of bite. I have to say this is a satisfying listen, as it's a structured portrait of suburbia, tackling a different subject with each song. It's not all about despair, of course, although there is plenty of that in here, but it's more about those subtle shadings. It's an album of contrasts, of course, opening with the rollicking Cook's Ferry Queen and closing with its polar opposite, the hushed, intimate, sinister comedy of Hope You Like the New Me. And between these two songs, of course, Thompson covers a whole range of topics. I think it's been described as his most affecting album in years. The LA Times have hailed Thompson as the finest rock songwriter since Dylan and the best electric guitarist since Hendrix. High praise indeed, if not somewhat hyperbolic, I think. But nevertheless, there's no doubt that he is a remarkable musician. And his signature mix very much focuses on the minutiae. It's a combination of those things, along with cutting insight, dark vignettes, and of course gallows humour. But what really comes across in these songs is what one critic has described as a keen empathy for characters at the brink of being overcome by their emotions, their pasts, or indeed themselves. On Mock Tudor, his last album with the Capitol label, he takes us by the hand and leads us through the streets of London. It's divided into three distinct parts, spread over different periods of time, of course. The first part, Metroland, is a section, of course, dominated by songs about women. and covers the period 1953 to 1968. Heroes in the Suburbs, which is quite ironic considering most of these are nefarious and broken people, focuses on the period between 69 and 74, and Street Cries and Stage Whispers, comprising of the last three songs, of course, takes us right up to the covers the last few years. It's like a cultural evolution mapped out in scars, desperation and fraught sexual tension. What is interesting about the music, here is it has a much rockier vibe, much more so than the industry album that he made with Pentangle's Danny Thompson. It's a real return to his, what I call his distinctive sound. Of course, many fans found that his double album, You and Me, somewhat quirky and a bit of a misfire. Whereas industry critiqued the destroyed lives after the loss of key industries, this one takes a rather rueful look at the psychology of life in the suburbs. The message I take from these broken individuals in these songs is that the desire to mean something's perennial, and indeed gives these lives in fact, meaning. Nevertheless, disappointment and deceit is very much a part of the fabric of the world they inhabit. The author Graham Greene once famously said that in human relationships, kindness and lies are worth 1,000 truths. And it's the 1,000 truths explored by Thompson on this album that interest the listener, these broken romances. Of course, broken romances are a well-furrowed theme for Thompson, of course. We get songs like Uninhibited Man and Dry My Tears and Move On. Love is viewed as a bit of a nettle that needs grasping, thorny and problematic, intangible, ergo unreliable. The deceivers and the deceived inhabit these little mini-narratives. The mantra, of course, in the novel Howard's End is only connect, but genuine human connection is difficult to detect behind the facades and pretense, and is a subject matter that lends itself so well to the bittersweet tones and ironies explored in these songs. Songs that are beautifully complemented by the whimsy and delicate phrasing of Thompson's guitar and that lugubrious voice of his. Cook's Ferry Queen is a great opener to this album. I mean, Cook's Ferry is a part of Upper Edmonton, famous for the Cook's Ferry Inn, which was originally a jazz club, but in the 60s housed some really memorable acts, bands like the Spencer Davis Group, Cream, and Led Zeppelin even. And in this song, which is a first-person narrative, Thompson assumes the role of Mulvaney, and the first lines are sung a cappella, lending a starkness and singularity to the story and character. And the remaining lines of the first verse are sung over a dampened guitar strings, perhaps emblematic of Mulvaney's character, indistinct, shady perhaps. Those wonderful lines, there's a house in an alley in the squats and low rise of a town with no future, but that's where my future lies. The song is concerned with his obsession with this woman, this Cook's Ferry Queen. He describes her at one point as where you find the darkest avenue, there you'll find the brightest jewel. The brightest jewel here is quite a telling metaphor, as it brings light to those dark avenues of his life. A metaphor pregnant, of course, with religious connotations, which will be explored later as well in the song. He continues to talk about himself and his how he's perceived. I think at one point he mentions, people only speak my name in whispers. But what's interesting is the music gets more frenetic, more frenzied as the Cook's Ferry Queen is introduced, creating a sense of sexual tautness and anticipation. There's a wonderful review online by Alt Rock Chick, and she beautifully describes this passage in the song as the music then explodes into a long instrumental passage dominated by hot harmonica and rousing beat, mirroring Mulvaney's intense animal passion. When Mulvaney resumes his tale, likely having finished off a pint or two in the interim, he elevates his poetry to an even higher level with some of the most memorable lines Richard Thompson has ever written. And those lines in question in the song are, she's got dresses that seem to float in the wind, pre-Raphaelite curls in her hair. She could get the lame to walking. She could get the blind to see. She could make wine out of Thames River water. She could make a believer out of me. And these lines are beautifully emblematic of the transformative effect she has on Mulvaney's life in the squats and low rise. The hyperbole here is symbolic as he furnishes her with messianic and almost supernatural abilities. I mean, she has, after all, saved him, even from afar, symbolising an intense beauty amid the intense ugliness of the world he inhabits. Sibella is a very much different proposition to the Cook's Ferry Queen. The name derives from the Latin Sibylla, or in Greek she's referred to as the prophetess. The head over heels narrator, of course, is speaking of a girl whom he describes as possessing salon hair and creases in her jeans, We certainly get the impression she's somewhat out of reach for him. He's kind of like a Tantalus figure, which is ironic really, as she likes to read the classics. And she represents those very middle-class affectations as the narrator assumes an inquiring tone, asking her at one point, "Did the tea time of your soul make you long for wilder days? Did you never let Jack Kerouac wash over you in waves?" She appears remote and inaccessible, there's certainly no doubt about that. And she's represented as something unobtainable and unreconcilable with his fleshy cravings. And the music explores some interesting contrasts as well, with the minor keys juxtaposing with the tribal primitivism of the drums. Bathsheba Smiles is also unattainable in a manner. There's certainly a pattern emerging here, isn't there? But unlike Sibella, she represents power and confidence, certainly exercising a power over men. In the Old Testament, King David lusts after Bathsheba after seeing her bathe. There is a remoteness to her. In medieval art, she's seen very much as a subject of the male gaze, as indeed she is here. There's a wonderful line in this song, "She smiles and heads bowed down," which is a beautifully emblematic of the power she exercises. I have to say that the intricate exploration of harmonies on this one are emblematic of a woman that represents beauty, grace, yet has something of the night about her. She's possibly a performer, exotic dancer perhaps, but she certainly incites the interest of many. Two-Faced Love is another interesting one. It takes the form of a dramatic monologue. The main character is scarred and contorted from the strange games he plays with his lover. It's a brooding dark rocker that has a feral energy to it. It deals with the attraction between seemingly incompatible people. The next song, Hard On Me, brings the Metroland section to a close. It has a dark film noir quality to it, suggesting the conflict between the animal and the human, the spiritual and the carnal. Metroland, of course, is the world where the male characters have to inhabit. They seem to be constantly stuck gazing from afar at women. A world, according to Alt Rock Chick, where the fight is between repressed sexuality and the semi-violent diversions of sexual urges. She then goes on to say quite brilliantly that the dissonant and loose guitar solo says as much about the psychology of the men that people Metroland. In many ways it becomes a lovely bit of metaphorical instrumentation and soundscaping from Thompson. The second part of Mock Tudor is ironically titled Heroes in the Suburbs. The song Crawl Back Under My Stone is a bitter howl of resignation from a man that has failed to escape those working class ghettos. It's a wry and witty take on a life unfulfilled. And the anger of being denied respect and agency is absolutely palpable in this song as he sings, "I'll crawl back under my stone, you won't have to think about, talk about, care about me." There's a painful longing in the heart of this character, but he doesn't just wish he was elsewhere. I think he just wishes he represented something different. He rather ruefully and sardonically sings, "I want to be middle class, floors and ceilings made of glass." Uninhabited Man is also a great one, with romantic ruin and disappointment very much at its centre. And Thompson is an expert manipulator of tone and musical texture, which is absolutely perfect for songs of this type. Dry My Tears and Move On is a plaintive number, of course, with some exquisite guitar underlying the brutality of dealing with loss and rejection. And this section of the album is concluded with Walking the Long Miles Home, about a man who has been in a fight with his lover and has to walk home drunk after missing the last bus. The final section of this album is a 3-song set. Street Cries and Stage Whispers is a series of vignettes about people who are attracted to the very heart of the metropolis. For example, the music to the sights and sounds of London town is so disarmingly pleasant as it creates an ironic distancing between the tone of the music and the subject matter of the songs. And the rather tragic figures that populate this song is quite telling. We get Gillian from Doncaster, who travels down to London to strut her stuff on the Euston Road. We get Jean-Paul, who came over from Toulouse. They told him that London was the golden goose. He never got his hands on enough to eat. He never got his arse up off the street. And of course we hear about Jackie, who's trying to get by with a nasty habit. And then there's the violent spiv Mickey, of course. The facade of London is very much unearthed in these little tragic narratives, punctuated of course with a bitter irony, especially jarring amid the saccharine tones of the music and the bitter acrid smell of myths being dispelled and champagne bubbles burst. That's All, Amen, Close the Door is another pain almost to failed love, and Hope You Like the New Me is a psychologically quite sinister number. The emotionally detached narrator describes how he's kind of assumed the life of somebody else, the life of someone he's vanquished. He mimics certain traits employed by his victim, hoping to reinvent himself. The dissonant acoustic guitar chords makes this a masterful display of dark humour. It ends on quite a chilling and deeply unsettling note, I have to say. A fitting end for an album that seems to be almost a tapestry made up of the threads of human imperfection, where dreams and expectations are juxtaposed with the cold reality of life in the city. Anyway, you've been watching an episode of Classic Album Review. If you haven't done so already, please do click like, subscribe and check that bell so you get notified of any future uploads. And if you appreciate these reviews and the work that goes into them, do check out some of the links below this video for the ways you can support me and this channel. It's always much appreciated. Anyway, I'll end as I always do. Thank you for watching. Do stay safe. But more importantly, please do keep listening.